Okay, we're dealing with criticism. And the key thing with criticism, of course, realizing that it is a fact of life, especially for the Christian life. I don't care who you are, if you are involved in some ministry in one way or another, a ministry coordinator, or if you're an elder, or if you're a speaker, you're going to get some criticism one way or another. A lot of people will say, after Sunday, whenever all the Christians go out to dinner, one of the favorite dinners is roast preacher, right? So criticism is a fact of the Christian life, as they say. And we're going to take a look at some important scriptures dealing with this topic. And the major one will be Numbers chapter 12. So if you want to turn your Bibles to that portion, Numbers chapter 12. We'll also be looking at Numbers chapter 16 and some other scriptures that deal with this topic. So the question, of course, always is, why the words? Why does criticism occur? And I want to begin by just asking this question. This is a seminar, so you can participate. Think back in your own experience. Can you recall a time, either in your experience or someone that you know, who was severely criticized for something in whatever they did in a church setting? And what was it for? What shape did it take? And how did you respond to it? Can you recall any of those experiences?
Not one.
Weren't criticized at all, huh? Okay.
Are you suggesting there's a critical spirit?
Right. Yes, that's it. Yes, Charles.
Yeah, I was.
Right. Okay. So the answer is yes. You can't remember.
The answer is yes.
Okay. And of course, how did you feel? You don't have to explain all the details to it, but what was the nature of it?
Well, I preached a message from the word that I thought was what the word was saying.
Right.
I still believe it to this day.
Yeah.
But a lot of people were very upset with it.
Yeah.
Because it stepped on a lot of toes.
Okay.
And so I was told, it's not a soapbox.
Yeah. Okay. So how did you feel about that? Yes. Everything's all set. Yep. Yeah. Thanks. So how did you feel about it when you were the brunt of all these verbal attacks?
Well, you definitely feel hurt.
Right.
Especially if you're in your own assembly and everything.
Right.
And it's hard to say. It was a while back, and I don't want to mention any names.
Sure. Yeah. Naturally. Yeah.
But it was just it was hard to take.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, just share an experience I had for a number of years. There was a fellow in our meeting who, for some reason, a much older man than me, he was like 30 years my senior, who felt compelled to be critical of just about everything I did. And I kept racking my brain saying, what did I do? Did I step on his toes sometime and not realize it? Did I insult him? Did I, slight him in some way? I couldn't think of any reason why this was. But it got to the point that, I was on the missionary committee in the assembly, and I would type up the names of missionaries that the assembly gave money to, post those things on the bulletin board, and this person would go there and check to make sure I spelt the month correctly, and, would circle any little mistake that I made and say, what brought this on, And I could not remember that I did anything at all. Now, there's a sequel to all this. There's a story, and I'll tell you at the end of this seminar regarding that. But I remember spending a lot of time trying to figure out why this was even taking place. And you're sensitive to it. You're very sensitive to it. And saying, what did I do? And hurt by it. And you do, for me, I was going overboard trying to make sure everything was okay and being polite and all that, diplomatic anytime I did things. But, I could not understand why that person was critical. And maybe you've gone through that experience, that you have said something or did something with the best of intentions. You wanted to please the Lord. You wanted to say the right things. And yet people were criticizing you for what you were saying. And even perhaps reading into your motives and saying, well, the reason why you're doing this is because you are interested in this thing or that. And so a lot of times the criticism takes this shape. And so we ask ourselves the question, why the words? Why does the Lord allow these things to happen? Maybe there's some truth behind it. That could be one reason. Maybe there is another reason that the Lord is allowing this individual to be your adversary, so to speak, to deepen your character, enlarge your ministry. There's always that possibility. So we want to take a look at these. And the key thing I want to mention, there's a lot of scriptures that deal with criticism that are worth studying. But I just cited a few of them. Again, these are on your handouts that you have before you. Job chapter 4 starts Job's defense of himself in that narrative. And begins chapter 4, goes all through. You know, his friends, his so-called friends, were his critics. And so they went after him and tried to read into the things that were happening to Job as for a certain reason. So Job 4 and onward talks about that. Numbers chapter 12 with the case of Miriam and Aaron criticizing Moses. That's what we'll be taking a look at in detail. Also, Numbers chapter 16, Korah and his rebellion and all those that followed him in his rebellion is a great case study in the anatomy of criticism. Why did Korah criticize Moses, and why did those others, and what was the outcome of that? 1 Samuel chapter 30 deals with David at Ziklag. If you remember the account, David had sided with the Philistines foolishly. And while they were out doing a raid on camps, the Amalekites came into his camp, David's camp, and these men, his men, and ransacked the place, took the women and the children and a lot of the possessions. They took them away, and David there and all the rest of the nation of Israel were crying so much, it says they didn't have any more power to weep, which is an interesting phrase. They had no more strength to cry. And then they began to criticize David. And so David had to respond to that. And so we'll take a look at that. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17 talks about David's experience where the false teachers were using his change of plans and then made a spin on it. And he said, these things that I did I do it lightly? You know, that when I said yea and yes and no, you know, they were using that, his yes and no, as proof that he was indecisive. And he really wasn't the great leader and teacher that the Corinthians thought he was. They were spinning this change of plans that were providentially done by the Lord and making it sound like David was up in the air in spiritual decisions. And so they were critical of Paul, not David, right? Paul, in these things. And so 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17 talks about that really, really clearly and nicely, worth checking into. And then chapters 10 through 12, up to verse 6 of chapter 12, is Paul's defense of his apostolic authority. And that's that great portion that says the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but the pulling down of strongholds. You know, mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. That's all in defense of the critics who said he wasn't really a great Bible teacher. As a matter of fact, later in that chapter he says, yes, his speech is contemptible. Right? Remember that? His bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. So they were criticizing his appearance and saying he's not even worth listening to because his appearance and his dress and his speech are not what should be a teacher of the Lord. That's what they were saying. So they're looking at the externals. So they're being very, very critical of Paul just by the way he looked. I remember there was a full-time worker that is with the Lord now, and when he spoke, he would carry out his words, and then when any word ended in an S, he would go like that. And I remember one of the elders saying, why do we have that guy as a speaker? Now, his content was great, but one of the elders in our meeting says, yeah, he says like that. And he was critical of this guy's, mannerism, of idiosyncrasy of ending his words with the letter S and dragging it out. So people can criticize for a whole bunch of reasons. That form of criticism can come in a lot of interesting ways. And so we're going to take a look at the anatomy of criticism and look in particular Numbers chapter 12 and 16. So if you haven't turned to Numbers chapter 12 yet, why don't we turn there and look at this great case study in criticism. And the first point I want to bring out in it, and let me read the whole part. Well, let me ask a couple of the brethren here. Who would like to read 5 verses, and 6 verses? First 5, Charles, Clay, would you read second 5, Steve? Or okay, the last 6, right?
Probably won't all go together because I don't use the KJV. I use the ASB. Okay, then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? And the Lord heard it. And the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. Suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and to Miriam, you three, come out to the tent of meeting. So the three of them came out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent. And he called Aaron and Miriam. And they had both come forward.
And he said, hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why, then, were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. When the clouds removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous like snow, and Aaron turned towards Miriam, and behold, she was leprous.
And Aaron said unto Moses, alas, my Lord, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly, and wherein we have sinned. Let her not be as one dead, of whom the flesh is half consumed, when he cometh out of his mother's womb. Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, heal her now, O God, I beseech thee. The Lord said unto Moses, if her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed 7 days? Let her be shut out from the camp 7 days, and after that let her be received in again. Miriam was shut out from the camp 7 days. The people journeyed not till Miriam was brought in again. Afterward the people removed from Hazeroth and pitched in the wilderness of Paran.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, well, as you know, Egypt to Canaan is a great study because it's got tremendous parallels in the Christian life. And in particular, chapters 11, 12, and 13, and 14 bring us the sins in the wilderness in the nation of Israel. A lot of this is talked about in 2 Corinthians chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, about the disqualification of Israel in the wilderness. And chapter 9 talks about the reward of the imperishable crown at the very end of that chapter. And then there's a chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians that talks about the disqualification. And a lot of things that occurred in that portion that are cited are right here in the midst of Numbers chapters 11, 12, and 13. Numbers 11 deals with complaining, the sin of complaining. You know, we think of complaining as a smaller sin, but God looks on it very sternly in chapter 11 and judges the nation of Israel for the complaints that took place there. This is another complaint in chapter 12, but it takes it in the form of criticism of Moses, the appointed leader of God's people. And then, of course, chapter 13 deals with the sin of unbelief, with the 12 spies going in and 10 coming out with a negative report, and Joshua and Caleb coming in with a positive report. Then it goes right on to 14, and of course, chapter 16 is the sin of Korah, the rebellion that he instigated. So, chapter 12 here, real case study in criticism. It's as plain as day. You see in verse 1 it says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married a woman of Cush, or an Ethiopian woman, a black woman, and he had married her, and this incurred the criticism of Miriam and Aaron. Well, let's go back for just a second. Who were Miriam and Aaron? Again?
Brother and sister.
Okay, brother and sister.
Older.
So, yeah, the older ones, right. The older ones to their baby brother, right? And what did Miriam do with Aaron? With Moses early on? Took care of him, raised him, right? So she raises this younger brother of hers, and he is now the leader. As a matter of fact, the source of the complaining against Moses really is emanating from Miriam, because I understand that in the Hebrew, the word spoke is in the feminine. So whether they colluded, Moses and Aaron colluded together and came to this conclusion, that could have happened, maybe not. But the word spoke there, Miriam and Aaron spoke, is in the feminine form, which means it's coming from her. She's the one that's really generating the strength behind this argument. And she's criticizing Moses for marrying this woman of Cush, Ethiopia. Now, is there any spiritual or biblical justification for this criticism? Personally, I don't see anything in the scriptures that would justify criticism like a malicious criticism. I could say certainly for concerns or questions that we might have, but nothing criticism. I don't see that in the scriptures. But someone has said you don't really find a specific scripture that forbid or prohibited Moses from marrying a woman of Cush. Now, some could look at Deuteronomy chapter 7 and say there's some justification there for that. But there may not be. But either way, this is where the criticism is coming from those closest to Moses. And I was, as I was looking at this passage, saying sometimes the criticism that often comes from those who are closest to us. Why that is, I don't know. Can you venture a guess as to why that criticism might come from those closest to us? I want to have a little interactive here. Yeah. They're closest to us, so they're around us the most. So they're going to see the flaws in our lives, right? Because, let's face it. If you come to a conference like this, people just know you a little bit. They only see you in a controlled environment for a limited period of time. But somebody who's in the local assembly who sees you, they see you week in, week out, or all various situations. The church picnic, you're overly competitive. Hey, that guy shouldn't be so competitive, Or they see you on a Sunday or midweek meeting, whatever. So that's a good point. Yes, Diane.
Also, I think sometimes they feel like they owe it to you because if it's a relative or like their mom or somebody, nobody else will tell you, so I will.
So they feel obligated. Keep you in your place. All right. Right, that's good. That's good.
Jealousy.
Yeah, definitely jealousy could be there.
Brothers were a little bit jealous.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's what Clay was kind of alluding to, right? These are the older siblings of Moses. And so they felt that it's their right to do that. So some people who are closest feel that it's their right to be able to comment because a prophet is not without honor in his own country, right? So those who are closest to us is those who might criticize. So don't be surprised if you are the brunt of criticism. It's going to come from somebody close to you. We're talking about dealing with criticism. What is the source of it? Where does it come from? A lot of times it comes from those that are closest to you. And that's what happened here with Moses. Now, again, it was a woman of Cush that was the argument, but was that the real reason? There's a verse in Psalm, and let me bring this out too. Psalm 41, verse 9. You are familiar with that verse. The verse goes this way. It was my own familiar friend who did what? Remember that verse? Lifted up his heel against me, right? Which is David speaking of Ahithophel, his counselor, his trusted counselor who switched sides when Absalom came into his kingdom. Why? Yes, I know. I think I know why, but go ahead. Right, correct. So he was probably bitter because of the adulterous affair that David had. Yeah, and that resentment grew. And it says about Ahithophel, he was as if he was speaking the oracles of God. His counsel was trusted counsel, but he flipped sides and followed Absalom. And David later would write in Psalm 41, verse 9, right here, that it was his own familiar friend that lifted up his heel against him. And, of course, that was utilized by the Lord in regard to Judas, right? Probably the 12 disciples there, and 11 of them were okay, but the 12th guy, Judas, was not. So a lot of times that criticism comes closest to us. Yeah.
And the picture is someone walking past you and just striking you from behind as he walks by.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that.
But, the hill is as he walks by to lift the hill
yes.
to kick you as he walks by from behind.
As he goes by you.
Yeah.
Good. I didn't know that.
That's the idea of the hill is swinging backwards.
Yeah.
As opposed to.
Good.
It's deceitful and
good.
There's guile involved in it. It's
yes.
just not. It's not face to face. As I walk by, it's like stabbing. It's saying "Ye too, Brutus," stabbing you in the back. It has that.
Yeah. Good. I didn't know that. Yeah. Very good. Now, in Numbers chapter 16, we're going to flip back and forth between these passages, but just take a look at Numbers chapter 16. Same incident in some ways, and this is rebellion versus the criticism. The criticism of Miriam was bad enough, but 16 is rebellion. So that was even a worse thing. But took the same course, though, if you notice. Verse 1, Korah the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, the sons of Reuben, took men. Now these are Levites. And of course, Levites were responsible for the transportation of materials of the tabernacle. Okay? They weren't priests. A priest would have to be of the tribe of Levi and of the line of Aaron. Two things. But these were Levites. And Korah is the instigator here. And he gets these other guys. And verse 2, altogether they rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation. So this rebellion is coming from the leaders. So again, those who are close by. Representatives of the congregation, men of renown. So these were leadership individuals who banded together, and they, verse 3, gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, you take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? Same type of thing. There's an accusation that is leveled, and it sounds legitimate. What's this accusation by Korah against Moses? What did they say Moses was doing wrong? According in their own words.
Just usurping.
Yeah.
He just did this because he wanted the power.
Yeah, yeah. They're going to him and saying, you are a power grabber. You're exalting yourselves above the assembly of the Lord. That's the accusation. What was really happening? Well, Korah wanted that same power, but he was using what he was guilty of and projecting it upon Moses and saying, Moses, you are exalting yourselves amongst the congregation of the Lord. And so it's the same thing, though. The criticism was coming from those that were closest to Moses.
Mark, can I make a comment?
Yeah.
You said something extraordinarily, not that you don't, but this is very wise. And I heard it put in another way by a good friend of mine, John Heller. He used to tell me, people that are power hungry think everybody else is too.
Yeah, right.
People that are not power hungry think that it doesn't ever cross their mind.
Right.
I said, man, that's so good. We should put that in Proverbs chapter 32. I'm sorry, I got to think.
Yeah. Okay. So those closest to you are that's often the case. That's one principle that we come away with here in this verse. Okay. So there are such a thing as an apparent reason and an actual reason for criticism. And so, of course, the apparent reason in Numbers 12 with Miriam is what? What's the apparent reason? What's the upfront reason for criticism?
And he married an Ethiopian or Cushite woman.
Yeah. So he married this woman from Ethiopia. What's the real reason? The actual reason?
They were jealous of his position.
Absolutely. Verse 2, right? 12:2. So they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. So why would Miriam have thought that the Lord is using us just as much? Why? What happened in Miriam's experience that made her think that she was just as equally important as Moses? Yeah, right. She was singing on the other side of the Red Sea. She led the people in singing. So she's got some influence. So there's one reason. What else did Miriam do in Moses' life?
She saved his life.
She saved his life and raised him. So hey, I'm pretty important. If it weren't for me, he wouldn't be here. Right? So basically, she could make that argument. Is there anything else you can think of? Those are the two big ones right there. But the fact that she was older, here's the kid brother. The kid brother's in charge. he's running the show in their thinking. And so in their mindset, definitely a object of legitimate, in their thinking, legitimate object of criticism, especially with the fact that he married a Cushite woman. So that just shows that his act is not all together in every circle, every part of his life. So what we can say from that is criticism is often concealed. There's often an apparent reason, an upfront reason to self-justify, or there's an action, and there is an actual reason. So whenever you are the brunt of criticism, and I might want to add right here, sometimes we'll be tempted to criticize. Maybe there is a reason for us to want to be critical of other people. Maybe we're suffering from envy and jealousy and all that. We don't want somebody to get that. We would like to be in that same position of authority and calling the shots and everything else. So we might fall into temptation of wanting to criticize. But on the other hand, we may be the object of criticism from other people. Yes.
Tragically, I've seen it on several occasions with the body of Christ, where a simple power grab is concealed with grand theological pretension.
Yeah, sure.
And and with pages of Bible verses that at the bottom of it was simply, who died and made you, Elvis? I want to be in charge.
Right.
So,
and it's self-justifying, and it's pretense, and everything you just described right there. Yeah. And I think that's what it is right here, because there really seems to me to be a spiritual reason. That you married a woman of Cush. Don't you realize that we shouldn't be marrying, outside our family or whatever, the tribe or whatever. So there is a pretense there. But that was not the real reason. So sometimes criticism is going to come that way. And that's what happened actually with Korah as well. So let's go to chapter 16. Again, we're going to bounce back and forth between these two chapters. But look at verse 9. Okay, the Lord sees this situation. This is growing. The criticism is strong. Verse 5, just for context, he spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and who will cause him to come near to him. That one whom he chooses, he will cause to come near to him. So he says in verse 6, do this, take censers, Korah and all your company, put fire in them and put incense in them before the Lord. Verse 8, Moses said to Korah, hear now, you sons of Levi, and this is it. Is it a small thing? This is how Moses responds. Is it a small thing to you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself to do the work of the tabernacle of the Lord? What is Moses saying here to this company, Korah and friends? What is the essence of that verse?
You already have an important position.
Yeah, you were brought into a tremendous position of authority. Is it a small thing to you? It's exactly what, in essence, took place with Satan, right? In Isaiah chapter 14. And Ezekiel chapter 28, you were perfection in the Garden of Eden, all these things. And then Lucifer, as he's described there, says, I will. He wanted more power, more strength. And that's exactly what happened with Korah here. He was already in a position of power, very close to Moses in terms of authority, and yet he wanted to be on the top spot. And so he's going to criticize and discredit Moses, Korah is. And he says, you're taking too much upon yourself, right? Verse 3, once again. Why then do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord? That is a strategic, trumped up charge to discredit Moses and his work. Which incidentally in the book of Jude says that's going to be the characteristic of the last days, right? They follow the way of Cain, doctrine of Balaam, and the gainsaying of Korah. Criticism of divinely appointed authority is the characteristic of the last days from the book of Jude. And the citing of it is from this chapter right here in Numbers chapter 16. This trumped up charge saying that Moses does not deserve to be in that position. All the congregation of the Lord is holy. Is that true? Not through the wilderness, right? All the sin that Israel was guilty of all the way through. And yet they're saying, hey, why do you exalt yourself? So Korah is projecting on Moses the very thing that he's guilty of himself. He wants to exalt himself. And that's exactly what Steve had mentioned.
There's a very interesting correlation between this and Exodus 3, because of all things, Moses tried to weasel out every which way he could.
Right.
Yeah. He was no, not me. I can't speak. Yada yada yada.
Yeah.
He goes on, and then and if Korah says you don't deserve this, Moses says, I agree, busted. I don't deserve this.
Right.
But it wasn't his choice.
Right. And it wasn't his choice at all. And if you go back to Numbers chapter 12 now, this is what happens in this account, Numbers chapter 12. God takes out all three parties, just the parties involved, which is critical. Someone said if you're not part of the problem or part of the solution, you have no say in the matter, right? You have to be part of the problem, part of the solution. And Moses and Aaron and Moses are brought out. And here's the justification or validation of Moses, just as what we heard. Verse 6. Then he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, if I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision, I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He's faithful in all my house. In other words, the reason why he is a leader is because he's got the qualities of leadership that obviously Miriam and Aaron don't have. We know about Aaron. The golden calf and all the different incidences that he had. And Miriam, we don't have any major marks in her character up to this point. But this shows who she really was. And he says, he's faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, not in the dark sayings. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then are you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So God here is speaking strongly to Miriam and chiding her. And so it's pretty obvious what's going on here in her experience. So the next point I want to bring out here is this. That critics will try to spread their message to gain an audience among those willing to listen. And it's happened with Miriam, with Aaron, and Korah. It went on to 3 others, and then 250 more. And then eventually in chapter 16, the whole congregation of the Lord. So eventually when they are judged for their sin, the nation of Israel, 14,000 died as a result of that criticism. Started with one guy who wanted power. And then it flanged out to 4, and then to 250, and then to 14, well, more than 14,000. The whole congregation of the Lord. But 14,000 perished. But critics will try to spread their message to gain an audience. Whether this is a form of personal criticism against anybody here that might be involved in personal ministry, or to elders and oversight. There's going to be those who will be critical, and then they'll share their message. But they'll cloak it in what sounds like a justifiable argument. Oh, do you realize that brother, what he's like, what he said? I remember when somebody was saying something about me. It was totally a dry. If it weren't so serious, I would laugh. I could have laughed. I said, you got to be kidding. Somebody said something about not being approachable, and I said, every time I'm everywhere, somebody says, oh, I like talking with you because you seem so approachable. You seem down to earth and all that. I've heard that for years. And then I have somebody say to me, well, you realize you may not be approachable. And, so this person brings out this argument like he thinks he's right about it. So I just kind of let it drip right off the back, But it's something that we all will have to experience, some trumped up charge that somebody might bring against us. That's not true, but it makes it sound true so they can get a following. And that's what happened with Korah. That's what happened with Miriam. Now, Miriam's following was just one person, but Korah's was a lot more than that. What's there a comment?
No.
No, okay. Yeah, okay. So, Miriam with Aaron, Korah with others. So that's an important principle when we think of criticism. Now, here's another point. Criticism never seen in a positive light in Scripture, issuing out of carnality and or misunderstanding. So what I mean by that is that I don't see a single verse in Scripture that says it's okay to criticize. I don't see it. Now, somebody in our last class brought out that verse, wondering how does that fit into it. Open rebuke is better than a secret, secret compliments or something like that from the book of Proverbs. I mean, open rebuke, if it's justifiable, is good. That's a rebuke. A rebuke, I'm not sure, is the same thing as criticism, because what I get the sense behind criticism is a malicious attitude towards somebody for whatever reason. That's what I see criticism. And I don't see criticism as never being pictured in Scripture in a positive light. But it really issues out of carnality, jealousy, envy, desire for power, these power grabs. Now, I do read in Colossians chapter 3, put aside all these, mortify your deeds which are by the body, fornication, all those outward sins. But then also the inward, the actions, the anger, everything else.
I was in 1 Peter 2.
1 Peter 2. Yeah. Chapter 2, verse 1.
Inward sins.
Yeah. Malice, envy, all that in verse 1 of chapter 2.
So that statement that was made to open rebuke, I think there's a lack of definition of terms.
Yeah, right.
Open rebuke in that setting is totally different than criticism.
Right.
I liken criticism to the Old Testament word scoffer.
Right.
And it's used in a similar way in the New Testament when it says that they have been mocking the Lord's return, and they're scoffing.
Right.
So it's been like this forever. Sure, he's coming back. See, that's a very sarcastic, derogatory, doubt-producing type of verbal communication.
Right.
And that's where I kind of make the distinction. There's a real hard attitude after one, the other one is not so.
Yeah.
And so I kind of make that distinction. We're not talking about the rebukes of discipline or the way of life. But sometimes I think that as Christians we say, well, since it's a rebuke, I got to make it really hurt.
Right.
And I don't think you're rebuking anymore. I think you're just, doing the power thing and you don't know it.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of other scriptural guidelines for speaking with someone about a matter.
Yeah.
But the scoffer has no rules that he follows except to really have the elevation of self.
Right.
I see a difference in that. Criticism is not usually, they don't come to you directly.
Right.
They tell others.
Right.
And so.
Right. And that's what I was going to say.
Open rebuke is coming to you directly. And saying, brother, I think you've made a mistake here, or that wasn't. But it's circling the wagons and getting your support before they come to you. That's criticism.
Yeah. Thank you
as opposed to open rebuke.
I think the emphasis of that verse is on the open.
Yes.
Yeah. Open rebuke.
Yes.
Is better than closed gossiping behind the scenes.
Criticism.
And it seems to me that if it's going to be done biblically, it's going to include all of the other admonitions. Let your words be seasoned with grace.
Exactly.
Speak the truth in love.
Love, right.
All of those things. And many times I think people, in their zeal to get out the whatever is, in their craw, they forget the love part. They forget the grace part. So
the emotional part of it comes through. Yeah.
In most of the cases, at least as you cite here too, it seems like, and I haven't done a broad study on this, so I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but it seems the criticism is always meant to tear down.
Yep.
And it should be hoped that rebuke is an intent to build up.
Right. To make the situation better.
Yeah, and the criticism too here is interesting because it seems like that it's a judgment of a person's character or their internal thinking, the reason behind what they're doing, their motivation, versus something they've actually said or done, which is usually where the rebuke is around an action you've taken or something you've actually said. The criticism is digging into something that you really don't know, but you're still
you're guessing at
judging somebody's motivation.
Okay, so here Moses, the externals with Moses, he's in charge of things, but they're reading into it. Hey, why do you exalt yourself? You are exalting yourself above the people of the Lord. Moses is just simply doing what he needs to do as a leader.
Exactly.
Isn't there a point at which, though, even when you're criticized, the first thing you think about is there any truth to that?
Right.
You take it to the Lord.
Right.
Moses probably thought that, but he let the Lord defend him.
Right.
And I found when I've been criticized, I asked others that were there often, did I do that thing? Or and just in my own heart ask the Lord. But then I let him defend my reputation.
Right.
Let the Lord defend you.
Right. Good. Well, that's my points in here too. So that's great. Yeah, good. Well, the thing is,
No.
yeah, right. You're reading ahead.
Mark, I'll make maybe one other comment. What I see in
make
both
as many as
these
you want.
passages is rebellion against God's order.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's God's authority. It's not maybe Moses as a person. In Korah's case, it's not attacking Moses as a person. He's attacking that God has an order.
Right.
And God has placed, and really, as you brought out, that was Satan's issue too. But that God's order is not right. And that can happen between elders and deacons who squabble in an assembly.
Right.
Some people would push women's order is not, their place in God's order is not what we perceive it to be.
Right.
I mean, there's those issues, and we see them often. But you're criticized because you're an elder,
right?
And this person doesn't believe there should be elders, or doesn't think, whatever.
Or the elders are doing the right job, so it's their job to rebuke the elders.
Right.
When the scripture talks against that.
That is a appointed position, or commissioned by God.
Yeah.
In each assembly to have something like that, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Self-appointed.
Going back to what Jennifer said, which by the way I think was outstanding.
Yeah, it was a good point. All right, so a lot of times it comes because there's misunderstanding. Somebody may criticize because they're a misunderstanding of God's order and His program. So let's take a look at that in chapter 16, number 16, verse 12. Moses sent to call Dathan, Abiram, and the sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not come up." So there it is. The challenge is put to them, and they are defiant. Says, "No, we're not going to come up." They don't want to deal with the situation. Now, by the way, just an insight here. Notice that On is not listed here. Remember over in verse 1, On was there? I'd like to think that On said, I'm out of this company. I'm realizing what is into this, and I realize that these guys are not right. I'm out of here. I'd like to think that that's the case. We don't know what the reason is for On not being listed, but On is not in that foursome. So it's these three, and they say, we'll not come up. Now listen to this. Verse 13. This is their answer to Moses. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness, that you should keep acting like prince over us? What's wrong with that statement?
Oh, it's exactly backwards.
It's just backwards.
Completely backwards.
You brought us out of the land flowing with milk and honey. Oh, I mean, the place where they whipped you with whips, and you cried out to the Lord in your affliction, and the Lord heard your cry, and that whole scene back in Egypt. Completely misunderstanding. And getting it just completely opposite. So, verse 14, moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey. That doesn't even make sense. He said, you took us out of the land flowing with milk and honey. You're going to bring us to another land flowing with milk and honey, and you haven't gotten us there yet. Well, God had said in Deuteronomy chapter 8, he was going to lead, or he led the children of Israel those 40 years in the wilderness. And so it was to humble them. He brought them into the wilderness to humble them, to reinforce those lessons of faith and dependence upon the Lord. All the rest in that 40-year sojourn. 38 of it was wandering, right? 2 years was led. 38 was wandering to make up those 40 years.
I also think they're actually going back 40 plus years and alluding to he was a prince status in Egypt.
Yeah, right.
And I think they're, how it's to bring, you always do this going back 4 decades. Nothing's changed.
So it's bad news here from that standpoint. And so they say, we will not come up, at the end of verse 14. And so there's a real defiance here. Well, Moses is going to call them out on all these things, and he gets the 250 censors, in verse 17. He gets all these, they fall on their faces. They do, Moses and Aaron. Verse 22, they fell on their faces, said, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and you be angry with all the congregation? So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the congregation, saying, get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Again, no On is listed there. And so they do that. They get away from it. Verse 27, and in verse 31, came to pass as he finished speaking all these words that the ground split apart under them. The earth opened up its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the men with Korah, with all their goods. It swallowed up and took them down into the earth. So God was vindicating his servant Moses. Now Moses was involved in the conversation here, but Moses didn't defend himself. The Lord defended him. And if you quickly go over to chapter 12, just back to those verses again, Moses is being vindicated by the Lord. He says, I've raised up Moses for a reason, because he's faithful in all my house. There's a reason why he's in that position of leadership. He's got the qualities to be in that position. And here you are criticizing him. So what happened to Miriam in chapter 12? What occurred to her? She became leprous. Verse 10. The cloud departed from above the tabernacle, and suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. Aaron turned toward Miriam, and there she was, a leper. So God has his way of taking care of that. There was definitely a misunderstanding in Miriam's part, and there was a misunderstanding in Korah's part. And so criticism can be contagious. Those involved run the risk of being judged by the Lord. Miriam was judged. Korah was judged in those verses that we read. And others who are involved in unjust criticism for reasons of jealousy and anger and greedy ambition and everything else that is not of the Lord, they were judged for that. Now, there might be reasons for legitimate criticism or other reasons for criticism, which we'll look at in just a minute. But we're talking in this context of unjust criticism that is received by somebody who's faithfully serving the Lord, doing the right thing. Problem is, we all think that we're right, whether we all realize that or not. Right? We all think that we have the better perspective of things because it's coming from us and our perspective. So we'll deal with that topic in just a minute. But criticism can be contagious, and those involved run the risk of being judged by the Lord. So somebody who does that is not doing the open rebuke thing like Clay was mentioning, but behind the scenes doing that work, run the risk of being judged. Now, 6th point on your handout, the events surrounding criticism can thwart the progress of the congregation until the issues are resolved. Criticism, dissension, can run through the ranks and slow the spiritual progress of an assembly down. And how's that pictured here in Numbers chapter 12? Did you see the verse? Right. Until she was brought back in, right? So look at verse 15. So Miriam was shut out of the camp 7 days during this time of her leprosy. She was disciplined of the Lord. And the people did not journey till Miriam was brought in again. And afterward, the people moved from Hazeroth and camped in the wilderness of Paran. So the spiritual progress was halted during this time of dissension and criticism. Again, one of these sins in the wilderness that you see all the way through these chapters. So it happened also with Korah in chapter 16, verses 36 through 50. The congregation of the Lord was involved in the whole thing. They started with Korah, went out to the 4, altogether 4, and then 250, and then a larger congregation of the Lord. And notice what it says here, going back to 16. The people complained. And look at verse 41 of chapter 16. Chapter 16, verse 41. On the next day, all the congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have killed the people of the Lord." Wonderful people of the Lord. These wonderful believers going down into the earth. Korah and all these great guys. And the 250 men of renown. They were really good people. That's because I think Korah was able to dupe the 250 and even the congregation of the Lord and make it spin it in such a way to make it seem like they had a legitimate argument. And so the people of the Lord heard these things and were convinced of Korah. A reminder to those in oversight and eldership and other responsible positions that one bad apple does make, like Donny Osmond used to sing, for the whole pile of them can make the batch go bad. And that's what happened here. I don't know if Donny Osmond sang that or not, but it sounded right.
Who's Donnie Osmond?
Sorry,
Sorry, I'm being critical.
That was an honest question.
he knows.
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
Mark. I couldn't resist.
Okay, I didn't become a Christian until I was 17.
You got a reason. We didn't listen to that.
I didn't grow up in Christian homes. Okay, so anyway, that there's progress of the congregation is holding. Okay, so let's take a look at some further insights regarding criticism. So why does criticism occur? Why does the Lord allow these things to come through? Well, maybe in a positive sense, the Lord is stretching us. Maybe the Lord has raised up an adversary, even though they may be a believer, to criticize us, to see if we can take it, see if we have the character to respond to it in a God-glorifying way. Sometimes, like it says in Genesis 22:1, that's Abraham. In case it says, after these things, God did test Abraham. So there are tests that come from trials or temptations that come from the devil, but there's also tests that come from the Lord. The difference between a test and a temptation, of course, is the temptation is to weaken our faith, and the test is to strengthen our faith. And so sometimes the Lord can allow some of these situations to happen, even though they're wrong, so that He can accomplish His purposes. He can strengthen us and make us better from it. In the case with Samson, the Lord allowed some of these scenarios to come up with the Philistines because He had an occasion against the Philistines, and He allows that to happen. Yeah.
I was going to. There's any numerous verses that would be
Support
added
that.
to that.
Yeah.
But for example, the discipline of the Lord in Hebrews,
Right.
and the that kind of discipline is like the discipline that somebody who's a recruit in the Marine Corps, they get disciplined, but it's not discipline for a bad thing. It's discipline for real war. As you go up. And then I was also thinking, even as we've heard earlier, the refinement of as gold as we studied in 1 Peter.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So there are positive reasons the Lord allows that, even though that's a negative situation. It can be used to strengthen the believer. And we've heard Bill McDonald quoted a number of times this conference. But think about his ministry and other people like him. He was president of Emmaus Bible College and various ministries. Do you think he went through his whole Christian life as an author of 88 books or whatever it is without being criticized? I'm sure he got criticized on his books, criticized as a president, whatever. And, criticism is part of the Christian life, but it's how you respond to it. And if you cave in and lash out, that can often create problems and you'll never get to the next level of your Christian experience. But those who respond to it well, in the will of the Lord, realize that the God can use this as a stepping stone. And 1 Peter does talk about this. What glory is it if you buffeted for your faults? But if you do right and you're buffeted, that's glory to the Lord. So who had their hand up? Yeah.
Looking at the response of Moses in both these cases, in the case with Miriam, he prayed on behalf of Miriam.
Right.
She begged for her healing.
What a great response.
Yeah, and even with the chapter in 16, where the people murmured.
Right.
He's like, Aaron, hurry, run,
Stop the plague. Right, yeah. It stood between the dead and the living, it says. Yeah.
That's a huge example to me of, how I should respond.
Right. Yeah, good. Yeah, Dan.
I think sometimes we go through situations so that we can help others who go through it too.
Right.
If we never experience anything bad, then it's all foreign to us.
Right. And the Lord did go through all those things. He suffered the shame and the spitting, unnecessarily. But for the joy that was set before him, all those great verses.
I had a chance to ask Bill some questions once, and my question was, how do you handle the criticism?
Bill McDonald.
We were on an airplane going to Mexico, right? So I had him for 96 hours, so I had 105 questions, And he said, when he answered that question, I thought it was really profound. He said to me, some of that's good, that deep austere voice. I go, it's not helping me, Bill. What do you think?
Right.
He said to me that if you're acting in a way that is near the edge of the critical cliff, then you'll get away from the edge.
Yeah.
If you're already far away from the edge of the critical cliff, it doesn't bother you.
Yeah.
I thought that was very wise. And then he said to me, we were talking about criticism of speaking.
Yeah.
And when men who study the word that disagree, or women who study the word, doesn't matter who. And so he said, well, I like H.A. Ironside's response. I go, you know H.A. Ironside? He goes, yeah, he was in my home. Oh.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, go on. And he said, H.A. Ironside said that when he was arguing, or a brother wanted to argue with him, he said, you know, brother, when we get to heaven, one of us will be wrong. And then he said, H. Ironside said, it will probably be me.
Yeah.
And Bill McDonald said, that's what I think. It'll probably be me.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, wow. Can I draw a graph?
Self-deprecating.
Yeah.
Good. So the Lord might be preparing us for a greater ministry, and with the incident with Abraham and Isaac, there was a great thing that was taking place there, but he had to take his son Isaac, and he offered him up Mount Moriah, but it was God who tested Abraham. It was a test and a challenge to go and trust the Lord even more. Perhaps it's a snare of the devil. Maybe God raises up an adversary because the devil sees you making progress for the Lord, and he raises up an adversary as a snare. I mean, we're not supposed to be ignorant of his devices, right? 2 Corinthians 2:11. Be ignorant, we're not ignorant of his devices. Now let's take a look at Nehemiah chapter 4. Nehemiah chapter 4. Here's a great example, an anatomy of criticism and with the express purpose of stopping the work. So maybe you're involved in a legitimate work that God has brought you into, and you are making great progress in that work, and there is an adversary that is raised up. Sorry, the wrong page. Hang on a second. I turned the numbers. So anyway, that's what happened with Nehemiah, and with Nehemiah, his adversary was with Sanballat and Tobiah and some others. So look at chapter 4, just real quick. It happened, Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding a wall, that he was furious and very indignant, mocked the Jews. He spoke before his brethren, the army of Samaria, and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? There's a ridicule, a slight. Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, they will break down their stone wall. So, here's ridicule, open ridicule about the foxes breaking down the walls. It'll be so poorly built that the foxes will knock it down. So that's chapter 4, carries on all through chapter 4 and chapter 5. You go over to chapter 6, the opening verses. In chapter 6, it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of the enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, that there are no breaks in it, left in it, though at a time I had not hung the doors and the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, let us meet together among the villages in the plains of Ono. Okay, here's the compromise. Let's talk about these things, was the gesture. But they thought to do me harm. So verse 3, I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? And that's a great verse. I love that verse right there, right? Because in the same way that Nehemiah here was being approached with a strategy by the enemy to criticize for the express purpose of stopping the progress that's being made, so too the adversary went against the Lord to try to stop him from going to the cross. A number of different strategic things, right? The temptation in the wilderness and all those things. So that even the crowd that surrounded him in Luke chapter 23, or the people who wagged their heads and said, you who said you destroy the temple in 3 days and you'll build it again, come down from the cross. It was an overt attempt to get the Lord to come down from the cross in their thinking to stop the work. But the words of Nehemiah could be applied. I'm doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? So the Lord refuted those who were there deriding him and scoffing at him, the soldiers, the religious rulers, and all the rest, to continue the work of going to the cross and finishing that work at Calvary. Same words can be applied by Nehemiah here in chapter 6 to the Lord's work. And so the devil, as a snare to us, can allow somebody to come in, the devil is behind it, to try to get us off or out of the will of God and respond to that and nullify our testimony for the Lord. So that could be that way too. The Lord could be stretching us in one way, but the other way the devil could be putting a snare in front of us. So that could be another insight regarding criticism. Now we still have 15 minutes to go, but anyone want to make comments on any of this? Just raise your hand. Okay, the third thing is maybe we're at fault. Maybe somebody, now the criticism should not take place. Open rebuke is better than whatever the end of the verse, because I went blank on it, but
Love concealed.
yeah, love concealed, right. But maybe there is truth behind that criticism. Now, even though the criticism is wrong, the truth behind the criticism is real. Maybe you are a glory hound. Maybe you are looking for money, or maybe you are doing it for fame and glory. Maybe all those things are true, and the Lord is raising up an adversary because you're not judging that sin in your own life. So what we see in 2 Samuel, if you want to turn to that, 2 Samuel chapter 16 is a great instance of that in the case of Shimei. Chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, where it says in verse 5, when King David came to Baruhim, there was a man from the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Jerah, coming from there. He came out cursing continually as he went. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David. And all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And Shimei said thus when he cursed, come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. I mean, this guy is really bold. The king and his entourage is coming down the street. And if you look, it says, he calls him a rogue and a bloodthirsty man. Verse 8, the Lord has brought upon you the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom, your son. So now you're caught in your own evil, because you are a bloodthirsty man. Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Please let me go over and take off his head. It's great. This is great. Just say to David, just give me the word and I'll take his head off and we'll finish this cursing and kicking dust and everything. What does David say? So verse 10, the Lord said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord has said to him, or Lord has bidden him, curse David. Who then shall say, why have you done so? And, even verse 13. David and his men went along the road. Shimei went along the hillside opposite him, on the opposite side of the street. It says, cursed him as he went, threw stones at him and kicked up dust. I mean, what a picture. But what is David's response? The Lord has raised him up to curse me, because David knew his guilt. What was his guilt? Bathsheba and everything that surrounded that. Right? And David says, no, he's appointed by the Lord to curse me, because what he's saying is absolutely true. So there may be some criticism that's legitimate. The act of the criticism may not be right. And the Lord has to judge for that. As a matter of fact, in Zechariah chapter 1, in the vision that Zechariah has of the man among the myrtle trees, God is, he's looking at Israel. Israel's in the low part, and the Lord is there. Angel of the Lord is there. The Lord himself, a man among the myrtle trees. But he chides the nations because it says the nations are at ease, but they further the affliction. In other words, God used the Gentile nations to rightly judge Israel for their sin. But then they furthered the affliction. They took it the next step. And so God is angry with the Gentile nations for doing what they did wrong. They were wrong in doing it, but God was using them as a chastening rod against the nation of Israel. So God was using these nations, so God had allowed that to happen, but the nations took a step further, and so they were judged for it. So it's the same way with that criticism. That criticism may be done in a wrong way, but God was allowing it to come through because David had it understand that was the reason why he was receiving it.
Well, David even heard that from the Lord.
Right.
Because when he wanted to build the temple,
right,
the prophet came in and said, "You can't because you're a man of bloodshed." I mean, after he told
right.
him that,
yeah.
then the Lord gave him another word, and he said, "You can't build the temple. You shed too much blood."
Right. So to bring this down on a personal level, somebody may criticize us, and they may be absolutely right. The criticism isn't great. We don't like the criticism, but maybe other people don't want to tell us what we need to hear. And God says, I'm going to let one get through and let you know what your blind spot is. Now, if you're married, your wife can tell you that, or your husband or whatever can tell you that free of charge. You know, this can happen. So, yeah.
As I'm not quite sure where this fits in. I'm not even quite sure whether God approved of this, but in some of David's last instructions to Solomon in 1 Kings 2:6, he instructs Solomon, deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave of the people.
Right, yeah. right.
David still had the last word on that.
Yeah, Shimei was judged. He had probation. He wasn't allowed to go, and he went
exactly
crossed over the line and God took care of him at that point, right? Because you never were to speak evil of the king. But God, David said, no, let him curse me. It's all right. So, okay, good. Well, dealing with criticism. So how do we respond? Well, first thing, in terms of criticism altogether, you get used to it and say, hey, in reality, it's there. It's a fact of the Christian life. You're going to get criticized, especially if you're in Christian leadership. You're on a pedestal. You're higher visibility, and you're going to be subject to an increased scrutiny amongst God's people. And, it's just the reality. Now, there's some people who just love to criticize because that's their nature. They haven't matured spiritually. They're going to take shots at you just because they love taking shots at you. And nothing at all with you. You're not wrong in the least. They just love to be negative. And so that can be, so you got to get used to it. It's going to happen. So you can't be overly sensitive to it. If you're trying to please everybody, you please no one. Because if you try to please the person over here doesn't like that. You try to please the person over here, the person over there doesn't like that. So you can't please everybody. And so in attitude, we got to get used to it. In action, it was already used by Jennifer in back there. Take it to the Lord. That's what your exact words that you used. Maybe you're reading my notes. I don't know. But in action, you definitely take it to the Lord. And that's what Nehemiah did. He took it to right as soon as he got criticized. Took it to the Lord. Now we don't want to be like David and react too quickly. So we have a few more minutes. 1 Samuel. Just go back to 1 Samuel and look with me at chapter 25. 1 Samuel chapter 25, this is the account of David and Nabal. You remember the incident? I'll just recount it real quickly here. We only have a few minutes left. His men were in the wilderness. David is in, he's being put out of Jerusalem, was by Absalom. And so he sends his men to go take care of Nabal's sheep in the wilderness. So now he sends his men back, kind of expecting some remuneration for that task of watching over the sheep. And Nabal's answer, when they come up to him, they were to greet him and say peace and everything else. They explain all these things. So they come up to Nabal and they say, oh, we're David's men. Verse 10, 1 Samuel 25, verse 10. Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away, each one from his master, like a runaway slave. A total insult. So the men come back, and what does David say in verse 13? David said to his men, every man, gird on your sword. Let's go. We're going to make the thing right. We're going to kill him. And of course, you know the story. They get over there, and Abigail dismounts and quickly runs in and intervenes in that situation. So David could have acted quickly to the criticism that he received, but he didn't. And because he didn't, everybody was spared from a lot worse situation. Of course, we seek the honor of the Lord in our response, and that verse that would substantiate that, Galatians 1:10. Do I seek to persuade men or persuade God? The idea is to be doing those things that are well-pleasing in His sight. So that's that verse.
One of the tests is it a fruit of the Spirit, which would be long-suffering,
Right.
Or is it a work of the flesh?
Right.
And if you are going to respond in the flesh or produce the results of the flesh,
right,
chances are you're not honoring the Lord in your response.
Right. Right. Exactly. So we want to seek to honor the Lord all the way in our responses. Okay, finally, make things right. If the criticism is true, maybe the Lord allows that to come through. Maybe that is the case. You have to be before the Lord and say, Lord, my heart condemns me. If God is greater than our heart. So if our heart condemns us, you can count on the fact that the Lord isn't pleased with it. So God is indeed greater than our hearts. So the reference there on your handout is wrong. It's Matthew 7, 3 through 5. That's when you need to make, that's a correct reference. But the next one is 5, 23, 24. If you have it, chapter 5, Matthew 5, 23 and 24. I left that to 5. And that is when you have aught against your neighbor, or he has aught against you. Make sure that you reconcile with your brother before you bring your gift to the altar. That's that portion. So if the criticism is true, then make it right. Make it right if the criticism is true. And here's a great one. Seek to be a blessing to those who are criticizing you. Maybe they are criticizing you. Maybe they are jealous. Maybe they're in the wrong and they're envious and they're jealous and everything else. Well, rather than defend yourself or just be quiet and go away, which is not bad at all, but even more so, bless those who despitefully use you and persecute you. They're doing that even though they may be a fellow Christian. And so it's important to do that. So that's what Matthew 5:11 reminds us to do. And so we need to keep that in mind. I didn't bring this up in our last meeting, but don't let it fester. If these things get under your craw, keep in mind Moses allowed some of that criticism to get under his craw. And Numbers chapter 20, he struck the rock out of being very frustrated with God's people. He finally got to him, and he was prevented from going into the promised land in this life. He was. And finally, in Colossians 4:17, there is an exhortation to Archippus. It says, say to Archippus, fulfill the ministry that you've received in the Lord, that you be careful to fulfill it. Now, why was he not fulfilling his ministry? We have no idea. Might have been a worldliness, might be other things. Maybe it was because of bitterness or a lack of forgiving spirit or something. Maybe he was criticized. We have no idea. You could put 1,000 different things in there as to the reasons. But we don't want to let it fester. The fact that somebody criticized us, we let it sit in there and it festers. It'll get worse. And eventually something will happen and we'll strike out. And that's where we'll have some other issues that we have to deal with at that point. Okay, so that's criticism, how to deal with it in some ways.
Let me ask you a question. So what I run across as I travel is either deacons criticizing elders or a group in the assembly criticizing the elders, and the elders not responding and not dealing with the criticism in any way. So I noticed from your two examples of Moses with his brother and sister, and then also Moses with Korah, is he didn't totally ignore it. The Lord ended up dealing with it. But sometimes if you don't deal with it, it makes it look like the elders are not capable of dealing with it, or because they're not.
It's true.
Not defending themselves, but because they're saying nothing, that maybe there's more truth in it, since they're not doing anything. So at what point? Personally, I don't defend myself to criticism.
Personal defense.
Lord, is it true?
Yeah.
His name should have the preeminence of my name. He can protect, and I'm worried about his name. But as elders, I see them not putting an end to or justifying, or even explaining why it's wrong. Because Paul, in 2 Corinthians, he clearly, in a very humble manner, explains why the criticism is unjust. So at what point do you, in all humility, point out that the criticism is unjust, not so much as an individual, but in a group setting?
I would say the individual, like the Lord, he didn't defend himself. So the individual, and I would agree with that. If it's a positional thing or a leadership thing, just like Moses did in that case with Aaron and Moses, both together occupied that position. That was leadership. and he did respond back to Korah.
Right.
And so I would say immediately. Why wait? You can pray about it, but if there's a charge that's leveled against the leadership, respond back, because silence might be construed or misconstrued by the congregation, the onlookers, as, wow, that person who leveled a criticism silenced the leadership, and they're silent because
it's right.
It's
it
right.
Must be right. Or there must be.
That's what they would.
There must be some basis of
right.
in their criticism.
And that's a very good insight that you're bringing.
Moses tried to meet with those other guys, right?
Yeah.
Not Korah, but the other guys. He tried to meet with them and say, let's talk about this. And they didn't have it. So that tells me that it's a good idea to meet with the people that are doing the criticism. That leadership should meet with the people that are doing the criticism and try to talk about it.
That's right. And in that case, in the 16, they didn't. They said, we will not come up.
No.
But the other case, Miriam, it showed where they stood. Yeah, the last comment for Steve.
I agree. I think there's two principles at play, and one is the principle of dealing with it face to face, and if that audience isn't granted, then you have to go to the next level.
Yeah.
The second principle is if the criticism is truly kept on a personal basis, then I don't think you need to make it public.
Right.
I think if the criticism and the illustrations you had easily went to the whole group,
right,
then I think you probably have to do something that may be public.
Otherwise it'll spread.
Right. But all the other principles of grace and seasoned with salt. But at some point, if there is an unruliness, then it moves over.
Yeah, you have
to. Disciplinary action.
Yeah, and you have to answer. Good. Okay. Well, thanks for coming to this seminar, and let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we do pray that you give us wisdom, and as we come across situations like that in our own experience, whether personal or corporate, we pray that you would give us the wisdom from your word to how to deal with it in a way that honors and glorifies you. We thank you for these things, for each one here, in Christ's name.